International solidarity. International solidarity. Thank you to UNAC for allowing me to speak today. I especially want to thank Sarah Flounders from Workers' World Party and Jeff Mackler from Socialist Action and all of those here who are part of the movement that kept the anti-war 23 out of prison. I'd rather be here than inside, so thank you very much. And we need to do the same for the Uhuru 3 now. Right on. So I'm going to speak to you about Simon Trinidad, who's a prisoner of the U.S. Empire. He's a Colombian revolutionary, was a leader in the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia People's Army, the FARC-EP. And I just want to say there's great importance to international solidarity that we're all engaged in. Sometimes, because we're inside the empire, we may feel a little isolated. But I can tell you from traveling to Colombia about 20 years ago on the most dangerous trip I've ever been on with Colombian trade unionists from the Oil Workers Union, that it matters to them. It saves their lives. And what we do here to stop the U.S. war, to stop U.S. intervention, to stop the coups d'etats, to stop the sanctions, makes a big difference over there, and it gives them strength for victory for national liberation struggles. Back in the late 90s, two things were happening in the U.S. One was the U.S. was coming up with what was called Plan Colombia, and a senator named Joe Biden was the main person that introduced Plan Colombia, which was a war plan to the U.S. Senate. It was a plan for misery and death in Colombia. On the other hand, in the middle of this country, there were two comrades. One was Meredith Abbey of the Anti-War Committee and myself in Chicago, who were plotting and planning how to stop this already. And we had the Colombia Action Network to do solidarity work. And one of the best things we came up with was the Coca-Cola boycott, which allowed us to campaign in unions, go to churches and houses of worship, and especially this campaign spread across campuses. Meredith and I were hoping with the Coca-Cola boycott in support of Colombian trade unionists to reach thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people. Instead, it took off like a prairie fire, and we were able to reach first hundreds of thousands and then millions of people with our campaign. My union at the time, the SEIU, Service Employees International, had a 5,000-member convention that signed on to the Coca-Cola boycott and opposed, in our wording, Plan Colombia, and said the U.S. should stop funding the war against the FARC and the people of Colombia. So big success. When we organize, we win. So from there, things were developing in Colombia. There were peace negotiations sometimes, but more often there was war against the U.S. and their proxies. You know, the U.S. ran the war in Colombia. Colombian generals were not in charge of the war. It was U.S. generals from Southcom. Someone spoke about that earlier in a workshop. That's who ran the war. That's who gave directions. U.S. intelligence, U.S. weapons. When I stood in front of the largest oil refinery in Colombia with 5,000 workers at 5 in the morning protesting free trade, what did the soldiers wear? They wore U.S. uniforms, and they had Israeli weapons in their hands. That's how this shit works. So we decided that when Simon Trinidad was captured, we needed to do a campaign to free Simon Trinidad. So who is he? He is a Colombian revolutionary who at the age of 37 left the life he knew. He comes from a bourgeois family, from a family that ran jewelry shops, were bankers. He went to the Naval Academy of Colombia's government. He quit a month before he graduated because he decided to take the path of trying to reform the system and organize people. And he did that for years. He joined the Patriotic Union, a political party which had 4,000 plus members killed by death squads. It was an attempt by the revolutionary movement and reformist groups to unite the left and elect people to power that would change things. But instead, it was attacked by death squads and assassins and never succeeded. When most of his friends that he knew and grew up with were either dead or forced to flee to other countries like Sweden, he decided to go join the FARC at the age of 37. I think that's a pretty amazing thing for someone at that age to go do. And he fought with them for many years. Eventually, he was part of their peace negotiation processes and helped tremendously to advance the negotiations within Colombia to try to get a just and lasting peace. But it wasn't to be. So later, he decided that the FARC needed to negotiate with the UN, and he left and went to Ecuador on his way to meet with Kofi Annan's representatives at the UN when the US and Colombian intelligence captured him, and he was extradited to Washington, D.C. to a jail. This violates the sovereignty of Colombia or any country that has extradition treaties with the U.S. In the case of Alex Saab, there is no extradition treaty, but the U.S. did it anyway. They don't follow any international law. They just make it up as they go. So in Washington, D.C., he was eventually put on trial in a federal courtroom, and we went to that courtroom 4 times he was put on trial, right? The first trial ended in a hung jury, and the judge declared that no one was allowed to talk about the case, outside of the courtroom to have anything to say about it. Well, before the second case began, the defense attorney, who was quite good, had figured out that the judge and the prosecutor had discussed the case because the U.S. prosecutor slipped up. So the judge was forced to step down from those trials because they were caught cheating, trying to prosecute Simone Trinidad and lock him away. And we were there to witness it, and we were there to tell the media about it, and it made big news in Latin America and all around the Caribbean, and especially in Colombia. So we exposed the sham that the U.S. justice system is. That's where the case of the Anti-War 23 actually begins. The FBI began investigating us because the judge was angry at us and started coming after us at that point. So everything ties together once you study it and figure out what's happening. So after 4 trials, 2 on drug charges, 2 on terrorism charges, Simone Trinidad was found guilty of 1 charge related to a big surprise, being a member of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which apparently is a crime in the U.S. courtrooms. So the judge gave him a 70-year sentence. They enhanced everything. He's at the peace negotiations with a rifle on his shoulder. That enhances the charges by 7 years. So they just throw everything onto it. So now he's a prisoner in the Florence, Colorado Supermax. That's a torture prison for anyone who's inside of it. There is no fresh air. It's only solitary confinement, the type where you don't even get to interact with the guards, right? Everything's done remotely, and you're by yourself the whole time. But through our struggle and through supporting him and through the peace process that happened in Colombia, he now has relative freedom in the prison. He can get books and reading materials. He can have conversations with some select other prisoners. And he gets to see his lawyer, Mark Burton, regularly. So where we're at today is things have changed a lot in Colombia. The peace process was not all that good for the FARC. They've splintered into 2.5 other armed groups. Their political groups that came out splintered into now 3 different parties. It's hard and difficult for us to find someone in Colombia to campaign to free Simone Trinidad. He was not included in the peace negotiations and set free, which would have been the time to do it. But we're still campaigning for him. We still stand with him. There's a mass movement that's emerged in Colombia that is very repressed, violently repressed still. They're still killing people every week. There's over 400 former FARC combatants who have been murdered by death squads. But people persist and are struggling and advancing the mass movement there. It's resulted in the election of a leftist president who's named Petro, and he is key for us going forward. We need to get President Petro to demand the freedom of Simone Trinidad so we can join him and build a movement here to force Biden to free Simone Trinidad. Thank you for your time. Solidarity.